Well, I guess something that's topical this weekend especially is wrestlers acting like idiots on airplanes. And we're going to talk, obviously, here just shortly to Evan Husney, one of the creators of Dark Side of the Ring. But I've heard the story of this flight, and I've been around wrestlers and or the wrestling business for 40 something years, and still when it's put in front of you with visual recreations and firsthand, because I wasn't on the flight, thank goodness, firsthand testimony, it gets even stupider. And a lot of people, and we're going to explore this throughout the program and the interview with Evan, a lot of people have said, oh, well, this is the way wrestlers used to act and they don't anymore. Well, that may be true, but it's not the way that wrestlers always used to act. Again, there's a disconnect between what people think the wrestling of the territory days was, what this was, and what the cleaned up version is now. The point is, I've been on planes in the 80s and 90s, private planes and commercial planes, with a lot of wrestlers, including some of the individuals that were on this flight. And I've never seen shit like that before in my life. And I don't know, I think I know, and we'll talk about this, some of the reasons why that guys started acting that way then. But I wanted to recount some of my more innocent plane stories just to give you an idea of in the 80s, when I first started flying with wrestlers to begin with, it was before 9/11. You know, we've told funny stories about how, you know, they just hand out guys tickets if they left the territory, and I would fly as Ole Anderson, or the Barbarian's ticket would be written out as A/Barbarian to kayfabe his real name. Shit, and it passed. It flew, no pun intended. But the guys were not going on commercial flights with the thought of attracting even before 9/11 and all the extra security, with the thought of attracting the fucking attention of federal authorities by fucking up in some kind of spectacular way. And whenever somebody would, infrequently, you heard about it. Chris Adams, right? It went to court, and did he go to jail?
He went to jail. He went to jail.
Because he got drunk on a long flight and headbutted the flight attendant and blah, blah, blah. But that was not like ordinary behavior amongst all the hundreds of wrestlers that took thousands of flights in that era. Right? There wasn't a lot of that shit.
Every now and then you'd hear a story about like guys like the Funks or Buck Robley or someone coming back from Japan and maybe having a good time on that flight, but it was nothing to this level, obviously. And like you said, it wasn't like everyone was doing this.
No. And I mean, you know, as I said, we used to do harmless things. I hate to tell stories twice. Yeah, sure, Cornette. But no, I do. But there's so many new listeners, and it's been a few years since I've told some of these stories. But the guys would fuck with each other on a commercial flight sometimes, yes, but not in a goddamn way that would require the intervention of the authorities in most cases. And Hennig, he was always a ribber, right? I've told a story, Stan Lane's, the Fabulous Ones, they're in the AWA, they're on a plane going somewhere, and Stan's wearing the Zubaz and freeballing, as most of all the guys did, and he's with both hands shoving his carry-on bag in the overhead. Well, there's this businessman in a suit and tie sitting on the aisle seat, right? He's reaching right over him. And Hennig sees the opportunity. Both of Stan's hands are busy, so he just reached over across the aisle and fucking grabbed Stan's Zubaz and passed him down to his ankles, and Stan's fucking member is dangling in the fucking guy's face. He goes, no. And Stan's trying one hand on the bag because it weighs 40 pounds and one hand trying to reach for his pants. It's funny. I'm sorry. The guys are fucking with each other, but nobody needed to go to jail over that or rehab or whatever the fuck. Stan used to get me. He got me one time. I've told this story at some of the live shows. back then, especially early morning flights, I've always hated flying. I've always been terrified of it, especially questionable weather, whatever. So I would stay up most all, if not all night. And so I would be exhausted and try to go to sleep on the plane so it would pass by quicker, right? And I would always have plenty of reading material, books and magazines. So I would sit in my little cocoon in my seat and I'd close the window shade and I'd try to be on the aisleway where I had some air coming to my face and I would immerse myself in whatever I was reading. And if it was a smooth flight, I would nod off. Well, sometimes Stan would do the thing. If he's sitting behind me, he'd roll a magazine up where he had some reach, and he would reach up and he'd ding the fucking call button for the stewardess. And I don't, you hear the dings all the time, so it doesn't really wake me up. But then she comes over, standing over, yes, sir. What? And then if you did that to anybody 2 or 3 times, then the stewardess is pissed. They think that you're yanking their chain, blah, blah, blah. One time, Stan goes in his bag, because I've fallen asleep with the People magazine on my tray table, and my head's just down. I'm just, wow. He goes in his bag and gets a Hustler magazine and opens to the most gynecologically graphic centerfold and reaches around me and slides that People magazine out and puts that magazine over the tray table instead. And it looks to the casual observer like I'm staring intently at what looks like a double-bladed axe wound. And every time somebody walks by me on the way to go to the pisser or whatever, they look down, men, women, some old woman, as Stan said, after the fact, looked like she wanted to fucking hit me with her purse. And finally, the stewardess comes up and gives me the Iggy on the shoulder, and I wake up and I see the goddamn magazine. I'm, oh, fuck. And all the boys pop. Nobody was harmed in the making of that motion, but that's what the guys used to do. I mean, yes, there's always been somebody's going to have some kind of fucking issue, but we laid low on commercial flights because we're around the general public and we can't be ourselves. When I've talked about Crockett's plane, when Jimmy Crockett got that plane, there would have been a perfect place to abuse the privilege if the guys were going to. They had started expanding so much, and we were doing such a schedule. Atlanta TV on Saturday morning and go to Philadelphia on Saturday night. Or one time we actually did on a Sunday, we did Atlanta TV in the morning, Baltimore at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and Philly at 7:30 that night. It was fucking insane. And the commercial flights weren't getting it anymore. You couldn't get there from here. So Crockett invested in, it was a G1, a Gulfstream 1. There was an old commuter plane that had been refurbished and used on a private basis. The thing was probably 20 years old at that point, so it was from the 60s. But it was customized inside with, it seated, God, was it 12 or 14? 14 people, I think. And there were captain's chairs and a couch and a TV with a VCR and a fucking stereo system and, the cooler for ice and a little galley and a pisser and the whole 9 yards. It had been a commuter plane, as I said, to seat like 30-something, but they'd customized it for private use. And he bought that thing, and everybody went through the moon about it. Because now we could do Philadelphia and be home in bed in Charlotte in our house at 2:30 in the morning, which was better than some of the drives in the territory. And you could make that, Asheville, North Carolina, Roanoke, Virginia double shot on a Sunday and still get home that night, whatever the case. Flair was on all of those flights because it was the top 14 guys until Crockett ended up getting a Falcon jet the next year because the G1 was a prop jet and its top speed was about the same as my goddamn Ford Expedition, it seemed like. It took forever to get, especially with a headwind. With a headwind, you were fucked. But he got a jet the next year, and then the top 10 guys would go on that, and then the next 14 would go on what we started calling the Jabroni jet. Point is, when all those guys were on the plane, Dusty, Magnum, Wyndham, Flair, Arn, Tully, Luger, Road Warriors, Ellering, me, Midnight, Rock and Roll, whoever was on the plane. First of all, on the way to the show, there was no alcohol on the plane. So it wasn't like anybody was tempted. The deal was that we had that plane to make our lives easier, not only make it able where we could get to these shows where we make these ridiculously large payoffs that we were making when business was booming, but we could be home that night earlier if, normally we wouldn't be back till the next day. So the guys didn't want to fuck that up. And also, it was just like being in the locker room. We were all amongst ourselves. I mean, Arn used to pointedly, give those jabs to Nikita because they used to joust verbally, because Nikita started out using his goddamn Russian accent on the plane when it was just us boys, right? And at one point, Arn said, "Cue ball, we know you're from Minnesota. Drop the accent." But Nikita was really into it, right? But it was a locker room atmosphere in that on the way to the town, nobody's drinking because we got to work that night. But everybody's talking and laughing and whatever. And then when we got there, the pilot's name was Freddie Floyd, which was not a rib on Freddie Joe Floyd or the Briscoes or whatever. That was his name. And he'd been flying guys in the Carolinas. He was a private aircraft pilot. He'd been flying guys for years. He had a ton of experience. And he always booked a co-pilot. And when we would go to the town or go to the matches, when we landed in the town, we'd give them money and they would go out. And if the guys wanted food, they'd get, it might just be a big box of chicken. But, the guys wanted beer, they'd give them money. They'd go back and get whatever. And they would have it waiting on the plane when we got back from the show, usually either take cabs to the show and then get rides with the girls back or whatever. And then, that's when everybody would drink, but it was beer. It wasn't like everybody was with their own personal bottle of Jack Daniels and all. And if guys were doing pills, I'm sure Hawk was, because he often would get, "Hey, Jimmy, how you doing?" But they did it on their own. There certainly was no hypodermic needles being brought out by anybody, whether they might be a suspect for using that type of thing or not. And everybody, and if Dusty was on the plane, we had to watch the Volunteer Jam fucking DVD, VHS tape, because that was his favorite tape. And at one point, I could tell you the goddamn order of the 2-hour show of every performer on it and every song that they sang, because that's all he ever wanted to watch. But yeah, the guys got drunk. There was never a fight. We're in a fucking small plane with big guys. Nobody wanted to fucking fight. The guys got drunk and fucking, if you went to sleep, you pretty much knew you were going to wake up with all of your hair, but Bobby Eaton may have tied your shoelaces together or tied them to the fucking seat support if he had enough time. Or if you're Tully, we may somehow, your alligator shoes may have got super glued to the fucking floor. We're not sure. But the guys were glad to have that. So they didn't fuck it up and didn't act like idiots, because there may have been guys that were best friends with each other and guys that didn't like each other, just like there is anywhere else. But there weren't these ridiculous tribal cliques to where one group has to fuck with the other group. It was all the boys, babyface and heels.
Can I ask you a question? Oh,
yes, please do. Go ahead.
This is coming up, obviously, because of the Dark Side of the Ring episode about the plane ride from hell. There were other plane rides. And when you hear some of the criticism specific to the overall nature, and you haven't touched on the, sexual harassment or sexual misconduct end of it, but would you say it's fair to say that when people say this is just the way it was always, the boys were always like this, that in truth, this was a WWE problem?
Yes. And I'll go into it more with Evan, but the guys I would not have wanted to go to sleep on a plane with the WWF crew of the late 90s. Whereas I welcomed it on a commercial flight or even on Crockett's flight, although those things were loud. You couldn't really sleep. Because I didn't really want to be in a plane anyway, but I liked I'll tell you this, and then we'll move on to some commercial business. Commercial flights, that is. But again, with Crockett's plane, it was the only sexual harassment I ever saw there because it was all male, to be honest. But I've told this story. Sam Houston, when he was dating Baby Doll before they got married, he got kicked off Crockett's plane for making out with Baby Doll in front of all the boys because we don't want to see it. And it made everybody uncomfortable, and they kicked him off the plane for that, for making out with his girlfriend. So this was not like the Wild West where everybody was acting up and going crazy. With the commercial flights later on in the 90s, I, again, did not take a lot of commercial flights with the WWF crew because either I was working in Smoky Mountain and only going up for TV and pay-per-view, or then I was working in the office in Stamford and we were only going over for TV tapings or pay-per-view. So most of the time I would, but I wouldn't have wanted to be because I saw how those guys acted. But like I said, the cliques that always wanted to fuck with each other, and it seemed like there was more underlying heat amongst the boys, each other. They were definitely great friends and people that liked to hang around with each other. But there was more heat, actionable heat amongst the boys in the locker room in the WWF in the 90s than I'd seen in the previous territories, NWA, places that I'd worked, Crockett, etc. And also, they just felt like they could get away with more shit. And it started to be a one-upsmanship thing where, well, I can do something even, crazier than you did or whatever. And I've always been uncomfortable on plane. The reason I liked Crockett's plane was because it was more, I knew the pilot. I could see the pilot. I sat on the jump seat on the takeoff because it was set 14 with a jump seat, which was the seat right in between or right behind the pilot and co-pilot. And it was regulations. Everybody had to be strapped in when you do the takeoff. So since I was the junior member of the team and smaller than everybody, I got the jump seat, which was fine with me because I'm sitting there looking at the pilots, smiling and having a good time. And that's why I was more comfortable on those planes than I was on commercial planes where you don't know what the fuck's going on. But back to my point, I wouldn't have wanted to go to sleep around those guys because of the whole, the guys in the 80s were taking pills and they didn't give their pills away. And they didn't, at least I never had anybody try to fucking gimmick me. But in the 90s, those guys would give their fucking drugs away to unwilling recipients just to see if they could fuck with them. And I wouldn't have trusted the boys like that. And then this is 2002. Now, when did they go public? Was this right after the stock thing?
After it, yes.
Because now I've, you go from a wrestling promotion where all the guys in the locker room are fairly harmonious, and suddenly they get a cheap old battered, beat up plane that will take them where they want to go and get them home quicker. So they don't want to fuck it up. And then you go to the 90s where these guys, they're flying all over the world, and I know they're fucking bored, and I know it's a goddamn ridiculous schedule, but they're starting to ass off even more so than normal. And then you go to 2002 where they've got a rented giant jet airplane chartered specifically for them with unlimited alcohol and flight attendants, and they're coming from a pay-per-view in England going to a TV in the United States, and they think they're goddamn legitimately rock and roll stars, and they start acting like it. And
that was Joey Ryan's excuse, remember?
Oh God, well, and I mean, these guys at least had a claim that they might be as popular as rock and roll stars, but that not like Ryan, but that didn't mean they had to act like it. And for whatever reason, the WWE, the guys have always been more over the top there, at least in that time period, 90s and O's, thousands, whatever. So, there's no excuse for shit like that from a safety standpoint, from a humanity standpoint, from any kind of standpoint. And plus they've got, Jesus Christ, Scott Hall makes a 15-second cameo, and that's enough. Otherwise, he's unconscious, and that's still enough to get named in a lawsuit. And all this other shit that was going on, there's no excuse for that in front of people. And even if it was their own charter, they're still civilians serving them and or flying them. And it just, that to me is the thing, is that, and we'll go over this again, like I said, with Evan, but there was a point in time where if you were in the wrestling business, this shit flew in large part because you were in the wrestling business. You went to the town every day, and the fans and there was no need to drug people. There were plenty of willing female fans. There was no need to force yourself on people. There was everybody that saw you, male or female, if they knew you were a wrestler and you're a star, everything's entertaining, right? And then you get in your car or your locker room with all the other boys, and you go and you do it the next place. And that was your entire life. And you weren't going to the fucking Metropolitan Opera and acting like this in front of people who had no idea who you were. But when the territories went away, the guys that got into business started hearing these stories about what supposedly happened in the territory. Well, yeah, all that shit did happen every once in a while, somewhere. But it didn't happen multiple times in the same place every fucking night. But those guys are trying to, well, now we've got to do this shit like they did. But meantime, the territories went away and your routine went away, and now you're not going to the same place 52 times a year, and you're not going to the people who want to be entertained by this type of thing, whether it's the helicopter or goddamn whatever. They're not coming to you. You're out in the general public, and you think it's still going to get over. And now wrestling is, even in the 2000s, yes, we'd been hot with the Attitude Era. But all of a sudden, there's a bunch of people involved in the periphery of the business that weren't just in the wrestling bubble. And they're going, what the fuck's going on here, when they see how these people act? So as the boys got worse in that time period, their audience changed from people who were not necessarily opposed to all this type of behavior on a limited basis to people who are going, what the fuck's the matter with these people? And at the same time, the guys getting in the business are trying to follow this standard that they believe the guys in the business previously set because they've heard all the highlight stories. And they think that's just the way it was. They're all crazy, Brian. They're all crazy.
In fact, some might say they're nuts.
But not in a good way, like our friends at nuts.com, folks. I said, they sent me a birthday present, and it was my favorite thing on their menu. So how could these people be bad? Folks, at nuts.com, which we all know is the best kept secret of savvy snackers across the country.
Wow.
That's 2 shows in a row I've got that one out. Nuts.com isn't just for folks who like to love on and hug on nuts. It's your one-stop online pantry shop. Whether it's a variety of snacks and pantry items, including candies, dried fruits, baking mixes, pasta, or like the delicious white chocolate toffee cashews that I love, the bourbon pecans, the crystallized ginger, the honey sesame sticks. There's nutritious, delicious, healthy nuts, dried fruit, flowers, grains, dried strawberries, custom trail mix, plus all the raw, organic, roasted, salted, and candied nuts that you can imagine. They even dip them in chocolate. It's a family-run business, folks, that takes pride in getting you the freshest items. That's why delivery is so fast. Most orders ship the same day. You'll have it tomorrow. It's fresher than the supermarket. And they've got gluten-free and vegan options. And Brian, of course, the entire Last Manor, the entire Last family, you guys graze on this stuff like you're just out in the wild. The fruits, the nuts, the organicness, the healthiness.
We are just like the deer on the land of Cornette's Creek, or I was about to say Castle Cornette, I guess is what we would call it. You know what my new favorite is? And it's something I never thought about before in my life in terms of freshness. And now I do. They have a whole bunch of items that are great if you're going to have, like, you know, if you and the kids want to do a special night and have sundaes, ice cream with all sorts of things, crushed Kit Kats, crushed Twix bars. They have amazing stuff. The Rainbow Sprinkles, a staple of ice cream everywhere. They're fresh. I mean, I don't know how else to describe it. It's such a weird thing.
Now, wait a minute, folks. I just want to caution you, do not put staples in your ice cream.
I said sprinkles.
You said it's a staple of ice cream everywhere. You do not put staples in ice cream. Don't put pins in apples at Halloween.
I don't understand why you're bringing this up in the middle of the spot. There's no reason to bring up any of these things.
Because you're always chastising me for suggesting people do dangerous things in the course of advertising our fine products and sponsors. And then you just tell people to eat ice cream with staples in it. And I said, just go no further with that. Fine, sir.
For the record, I didn't. And of course, nuts.com doesn't sell staples. But if they did, they would be delicious staples. But I encourage everyone to try the Rainbow Sprinkles. They are fresh.
They're a staple of ice cream. Folks, right now, if you text 64,000, or do it the other way around, text experience. Shut up now. You'll do this. You'll see it's not a number to a word. It's a word to a number. The other part doesn't work out. So if you text experience to 64,000, that's 64 with 3 zeros behind it, experience to 64,000, then new nuts.com customers get free shipping on their first order. All you have to do, somehow it works out. I don't know how they know. They're keeping an eye on you, folks. Text experience to 64,000, and you get free shipping on your first order from nuts.com. You don't know how to spell it? I'll tell you now. Nuts. That's nuts to you. Nuts.com. Terms apply. Available at nuts.com/terms. Have you come to terms with your nuts yet, Brian?
I've come to terms with my nuts, and I love nuts.com, of course.